and wetter by the weekend. Bye-bye.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
You really could become the next big Great British Giveaway winner with your chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash to spend on anything you like. Listen to what some of our previous winners have to say about winning big with us.
On the day that I got the money in the bank account, everything just seemed a lot sunnier.
But I do have something to spend it on.
Just go for it. It's an absolute must.
Thank you, GBNews.
Amazing feeling to win.
For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2. Or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment.
This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory.
Don't miss My Big Opinion, Mark Meets and My Take at 10.
Democracy is a funny old thing.
And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it.
Go and get another glass of that bubbly. You've earned it.
That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threats on.
As time passes,
She could have saved Storm.
you made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter, with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
I can become something different.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates. You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it?
Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation. Tonight, the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss, will be joining me live in the studio in a moment as she unleashes a forensic deconstruction of the Chancellor's new plans to hand power to the blob. Who controls Britain? Is it the politicians who you vote for, or is it unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats who can't be removed? We will be examining carefully with the former Prime Minister. Meanwhile, junior doctors have been granted an inflation-busting pay rise, while pensioners have had their winter fuel payments scrapped. Plus, we always set the record straight here at GB News. We reported that a Tory MP was considering defecting to Reform. We were wrong and hold our hands up for it. Martin Vickers will join me in a moment. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my particularly pugnacious panel, former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the PR consultant and former Labour aide, Stella Santikadu. As ever, let me know your views, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's your favourite part of the day, the News Bulletin with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, the top story from the GB newsroom tonight is that hundreds of people have gathered for a vigil to remember the victims of the knife attack in Southport. Our reporter, Will Hollis, was there.
A lot of people will be next to strangers right now, but they're coming together in shock, in grief, in pain, but united in the feeling that this is not what people want to see in their communities happening to the most vulnerable of people. The pain here is so much, and people are hurting in a way that few people hurt in their lifetimes.
Will Hollis. Well, earlier the Prime Minister paid tribute to the victims of the knife attack, but he was faced with hostile shouts from the crowd as he laid down a wreath and stood in silence. Some people shouting, "How many more?" The Prime Minister says it is now his mission to crack down on knife crime. Well, his visit came as police named the 3 little girls who've lost their lives in that stabbing attack. They are 7-year-old Elsie Dot Stankham, 9-year-old Alice Aguirre, and 6-year-old Baby King. Speaking in the House of Commons this evening, the Home Secretary described the scenes in Southport as an unspeakable tragedy. Yvette Cooper told MPs it's difficult to comprehend the horror emergency workers faced when they arrived.
Police, the North West Ambulance Service and Merseyside Fire and Rescue, who arrived at an unimaginably distressing scene yesterday and who responded with heroic professionalism. Aided by passers-by, NHS workers and off-duty emergency workers who heard the calls of distress and ran to help. As the police officers said to me when we spoke, they do these jobs knowing they can be called upon in the toughest of times, but nothing still can prepare you for an attack on little children.
Well, 5 other children and 2 adults remain in a critical condition in hospital today after what was described as a ferocious attack, which took place at a Taylor Swift-themed dance workshop. The pop star herself paying tribute to the victims now, saying she's in shock at the loss of life and the horrendous trauma, adding they were just little kids. Now, news away from the events in Southport today and on to international news. Leave Lebanon immediately is the warning from the British Foreign Office today to all British people living or travelling there, as tonight Israel claimed responsibility for a retaliatory airstrike on Beirut. Here's the latest footage just coming in to us. You can see there the immediate aftermath of that blast in Beirut, where tensions with Israel are understood to be escalating quickly. An unknown number of people have been killed in that airstrike, multiple people wounded. In the southern suburb of Beirut, it's understood the target was a senior Hezbollah military commander, the Israeli Defense Forces claiming he was responsible for an airstrike on a football field in the occupied Golan Heights, which killed 12 children at the weekend, something the militant group itself denies. That's the very latest news from the GB Newsroom. I'm Polly Middlehurst. I'm back in an hour. See you then.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. Who governs? Who runs Britain? Every so often, the electorate gives a mandate to politicians to govern, as it did a few weeks ago. But increasingly, general elections are becoming a charade, a veneer, a husk. The Labour Party wants you to believe that politicians are in control, but if Sir Keir Starmer gets his way, politicians will be there merely to take responsibility for decisions made by anonymous, unelected and unaccountable quangocrats. While I was in government with Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, to whom I will be speaking in a moment, we tried to take on the bureaucracy. We wanted to take radical action that was necessary to revive the struggling British economy. That meant cutting taxes, reducing the size of the state, unleashing Britain's growth, and crucially, returning power to democratically elected politicians from the blob. Turned out we paid quite a high price for this. And then the erroneous narrative followed that it was Liz who trashed the economy. But this turns out to be untrue. And it's not people like me who are saying this, it's not people who are partisan, except in the other direction, because the Bank of England has admitted that it not only failed to inform the executive of the looming pensions crisis, but it also began a round of quantitative tightening just as the mini-budget was announced. Labour has seized upon the narrative and made it the basis for its economic policy, so-called securonomics. And today, Parliament debated the second reading of the government's Budget Responsibility Bill. While on the face of it, this may sound sensible, in reality it gives more power to the bureaucrats of the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, effectively putting future governments into a bureaucratic fiscal straitjacket. Soon, economic policies will only be pursued if they adhere to the liberal groupthink narrative that dominates the ABR. And this is an institution that gets almost all of its forecasts wrong. Since 2010, the ABR, according to its own assessment, has on average misjudged the UK's public sector net borrowing by £52.5 billion, makes Rachel Reeves' £20 billion look like a drop in the ocean, and miscalculated the UK's growth by £46.5 billion per year. But the point is that this is just one move of many in Labour's agenda that undermines democracy. Soon democracy will be but a facade, a manipulation, a way of continuing the illusion for the electorate. You may elect a new government, but that won't matter because the bureaucrats will make the real decisions behind the scene and they will remain the same. Nobody can vote to remove Andrew Bailey, however wrong he gets it. And so although this may sound like a technical point, we are facing the slow demise of democracy. As ever, let me know your views on mailmog@gbnews.com. But I'm joined now by my pugnacious panel, the former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the PR consultant and former Labour aide, Stella Stantikidou. Stella, the Bank of England has admitted it bungled. It put out a report in May saying, actually, the increase in interest rates around the mini-budget was mainly created by the Bank of England.
Yes, and I understand the frustration against what is happening with the Bank of England. However, we need to consider what would be there in its place. As you know, Jacob, I have deep respect for this country, for its institutions and for its history. And I am tired of people complaining about a big state or a small state or whatever the state is doing. Now, there was a time in the British Empire's history where it did some things well. And the things that it did well had to do with good governance. Because government, right now, we may not have an empire to manage, we may not have an empire to take care of, but we have complex institutions in our country. We have the NHS, we have the welfare state, we have our parliament, we have the civil service. So modern government is very, very complex. And Britain, it's at its best when it embraces sensible government, which brings stability in an otherwise completely chaotic world.
Now, I'm obviously going to be able to talk to Liz Truss about this in a moment, but actually, when we're at our best, we had quite a thin layer of government. We had a very small number of people running a vast empire. Now we've got a very, very large number of people incompetently running a small state.
I think that part of the social contract that the British people have come to expect from that history of the British Empire is that the institutions that the government builds are not just going to last until the next general election, but they will last for generations and they will be building on existing knowledge.
Well, let's hope, Calvin, if they do last, they're not as incompetent as the ABR.
Well, I think the problem with the ABR, I mean, there's an old phrase which you all know that economists astrologers were invented to make economists look good, you know, and that is the reality, is that economists are looking at numbers backwards. Nobody knows what's going to happen going forwards. Therefore, the idea that we're now going to be in some kind of straitjacket, look, the first thing that the Tories should announce that if Labour decide to go down this route, they will dismantle it when they get in. There is no point in changing the politics if you can't change the economics.
But isn't it fundamentally a political rather than a technical decision how you run economic policy? It's not a science of economics. And you see all this modelling we've had, modelling that led to the financial crisis, modelling that was completely wrong on COVID deaths.
Literally, if you've ever run a business, you know this. You never know what's coming around the corner. And the idea that you can plot going forward when you're looking at numbers from behind you is literally impossible. So the mistakes that are going to be made will be baked in.
And so this seems important, because obviously we can discuss this with Liz in a moment. And she was held accountable for what she did. Indeed, lost office. The Conservatives lost office. But the head of the ABR, which has been invariably wrong, the Bank of England, that has been stunningly wrong in recent years, they are in secure jobs, they're paid hundreds of thousands of pounds, and however useless they are They are unaccountable to voters, and that really hits at democracy.
I 100% agree. There needs to be more accountability to people who make policy and people who influence policy and people who implement policy. There needs to be a lot more accountability because unlike the private sector, they never get to be fired. They get to stay in their jobs and even get promoted. However, and even though I'm left-wing, Jacob, one thing that I do recognise as a conservative value that feels intuitive to me, and I think to a lot of people, regardless of political party, is that you do not replace something until you are sure that you have a better alternative. And in my opinion, it is in that most fundamental of conservative values, conservative duties, that the Tories under Liz Truss and under Rishi Sunak entirely failed.
But the institution that we got, the ABR, is relatively new, and the idea of central bank independence was one that really grew out of the post-war success of the Bundesbank. And the Bundesbank was very different and had a different constitutional position. The Bank of England has not used its independence anything like as effectively as the Bundesbank did up until about 2000.
OK, so a question for you. You say that it's all down to the Bank of England. However, one would say that the crash that came after Liz Truss's mini-budget was down to the markets, and the markets reacting to this shock, to this instability.
The Bank of England itself, in a report that came out in May, quietly, has admitted that 2/3 of the rise in interest rates was the fault of the Bank of England. So they've admitted
so
it was
do you think that the market would not have reacted to Liz Truss's budget? Because I think that what is happening with the Labour Party statement that we saw, the speech that we saw this week, is that they're really trying to stabilise the market. They're trying to make everyone feel safe.
There would have been a response, but the degree of response was actually mainly 2/3 the responsibility of the Bank of England, and the bank has admitted this, which is quite interesting. Because
but the problem, I'm afraid, here is that Liz was painted as a bad actor, and the game was up. Right? There was no once you start seeing your mortgages head upwards. Under it doesn't matter what the reality of life is. This report came out in May. I'd never heard about it. I follow this kind of stuff. Had you followed it?
I hadn't heard about it.
Right,
until
you
yesterday.
hadn't heard about it. I wonder whether even Miss Truss had heard about it. And now, of course, she has got it. She's now, pushing the argument. My problem is, I think for ordinary people, that moment has gone.
Isn't it not about going through the history of the Liz Truss administration, but looking at how we're governed, and that actually you want politicians who are accountable? Liz was accountable. That's perfectly proper, because you're accountable for what happens when you're Prime Minister, even if it's not your fault. But if these organisations are making decisions, you're accountable for other people's mistakes.
Yes, honestly, look, I accept this. The OBR guy I have been listening to on the Today programme literally the last 2 or 3 years. He's always a genius, right? The reason he's a genius, he's got all the facts there and he's saying this. What they're now saying is we are now going to decide policy going forward. So, and that is absolute madness. Nobody knows what's happening. Otherwise, COVID, right?
And the OBR is one of the most useless institutions in the country, isn't it? It's always wrong by tens of billions of pounds a year.
Right-wing economists are almost always wrong, which is why I'm not right-wing.
Right. But the ABR is staffed full of left-wing economists.
Absolutely not. The left-wing economics I know despise the OBR as much as you do.
They come out of the Resolution Foundation, and the head of the Resolution Foundation has just become a Labour MP.
Because it's good experience.
It's a complete lefty
absolutely not. Absolutely not. That is 100% not true. The thing is, Jacob, that the right way to reform a system like the OBR is you go slowly, catchy monkey. You just don't go and drop a bomb. You don't make a radical change like this to a country like the UK.
All right, we won't set the Just Stop Oil people on the ABR. Not yet, at any rate. Thank you to my panel. In a moment, we will be hearing from Liz Truss herself as she unleashes her attack on the death of democracy desired by this socialist government. Thank you very much.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Football and gambling can go hand in hand and cause long-term problems. New figures show that young adults aged between 16 and 24 who have bet over the last year are more likely to report mental health issues compared to those in older age groups.
And joining us now to discuss this is Matt Burgess, who is a former gambling addict and now helps those to deal with their own gambling issues.
Yeah, I think gambling is one of those things that is so accessible now. You know, everyone's got a kind of mobile phone in their pocket, walk around with a kind of 24-hour casino, if you like. So I think it's really important that people realise that we have to sort of recognise that that is a month of quite condensed gambling, and we don't want people to sort of carry that on into their everyday life, because that's when it can become really risky and you know, it could become addictive.
I had no idea, though, that it was linked to first-time gambling. For the first time, people might be able to pick up and have a go. And then it doesn't end there. It goes on, because by then you've got the bug. Is that how it works?
You've got to remember, for things like the Euros, the World Cup, so you get a lot more people watching football and therefore potentially betting on football.
May I ask you about how severe your own gambling addiction got?
Well, look, I think there was a couple of touch points for me where I realised that things were getting out of hand. There were some times at university where, you know, I kind of thought, you know, I'm definitely doing this a bit too much, but, you know, kind of thought maybe it would move on once I left, but it didn't. It did follow me. And then, you know, I got to points where I was at my worst gambling 16, 17 hours a day. I was spending huge amounts of money. It can spiral out of control very, very quickly, and that was the important thing that we want to highlight is, you know, what can start as fun can become very, very dangerous in a sense.
GB News, the People's Channel. Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m, followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain, followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation, and now it's the moment you've all been waiting for. Joining me to discuss the Labour Party's surrender to the bureaucracy is the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Liz, first of all, thank you very much for joining me. You got the blame, and Labour ran this hard through the election campaign for crashing the economy because of the mini-budget. I was one of your ministers at the time, so I take a share of responsibility for that too. And there's this really interesting report from the Bank of England, and it now seems it was Bank of England who crashed the economy. Can you explain what they have admitted to, what it has admitted to?
So the Bank of England put out a report in May with no fanfare whatsoever. It's available on their website. And what they demonstrate is that 2/3 of all of the market movement on gilts was down to LDIs. So this is the special type of investment that pension funds had been encouraged to do and were very, very susceptible to small changes in the interest rate. So the spike we saw after the mini-budget was, in fact, down to these products that the Bank of England, who are responsible for financial stability, had failed to ensure were being properly managed. I mean, that's what happened. So they admit 2/3 of all of that market movement was essentially down to them.
And they lost a lot of money in their own pension fund on these instruments because of the movements in government debt.
That is true. And of course, lots of other major pension funds were invested. In fact, the UK had 60% of the world's LDIs held, partly because of the way that pension funds were regulated and supervised, which was the responsibility of the pensions regulator and Bank of England. It's worth saying I knew nothing about this. Mm-hmm. So when we put together the mini-budget, which was fully signed off internally in government, we had no expectation at all that there would be this problem triggered. So we didn't know about it. And I'm all for politicians taking responsibility, but it's difficult to take responsibility for something you don't know about, that people who do know about it, you can't sack them, you can't change them, they are there, that puts a politician in a very difficult position.
But did we, in fact, make a bigger mistake? And that is that we didn't focus on trying to change the institutions, that we knew there were issues with the Bank of England and we knew that there were issues with the ABR, and we weren't willing to say the ABR must be closed down. It was just cut out of the discussion.
Well, look, I would have loved to close the ABR down, and I would have loved to make the Bank of England more accountable to ministers. But the reality is we had 2 years until an election. I thought the most important priority was getting the British economy growing. I thought we would have no chance of winning the election until we started putting money in people's pockets. And you know how long legislation takes. You were leader of the House. You know, we would have not got the legislation through. In fact, we'd still be debating the ABR and the Bank of England 2 years later, and the British public would be saying, what on earth have you been doing, Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg? You've been in the House of Commons, changing institutional structures. Meanwhile, you're not getting on with the very important tax changes, regulatory changes that we need to make Britain work. Now, in a future Conservative government, of course, we need to sort out these institutional structures, and we need to be very clear about that. But what's happening today is Labour actually making the situation worse. We struggled because too much power had been handed over to unelected bureaucrats. They want to double down on that. I mean, it's amazing. The Chancellor seems to want to make no decisions about the economy. Gordon Brown handed over the power to the Bank of England over interest rates, and now Rachel Reeves wants to hand over all the power on fiscal policy to the Office of Budget Responsibility. You might ask, what is she actually there for?
And the ABR's record is terrible. I mean, year in, year out, it gets its forecast wrong, and yet it's held up as this body of wise people that comes up with unchallengeable forecasts. How have we got into this state? Is it that politicians have lost confidence in their own judgment? Because the ABR was obviously set up by a Conservative government. It's not the only example of a quango. Natural England, the Climate Change Committee, these bodies that increasingly make policy, and the politicians just seem to sit back and let them do it. Have we lost confidence in our own profession?
I certainly think it's true that politicians have outsourced a lot of decision-making. I mean, the ABR is particularly dysfunctional because the Treasury now doesn't have the expertise to do forecasting, so it can't do one half of the job. The OBR doesn't know all the inside details of what's actually going on in government, so it can only do half the job. You have a crazy situation, and I saw this as Chief Secretary, where the OBR sends new figures every 2 weeks, and suddenly £20 billion will appear, and suddenly £20 billion will disappear according to the particular forecast that week, and that is no way to run a country. So what has happened is, if you look at Nigel Lawson or Geoffrey Howe, the great chancellors of the 1980s, they had full responsibility for monetary and fiscal policy. They decided, we're monetarists, we're going to focus on the money supply. What happened is when the Bank of England was independent, they independently decided not to focus on the money supply. So there was no measure of the money supply in their inflation model. But that wasn't a political decision. That was just a decision by the Bank of England themselves. So those decisions that had previously been made by chancellors had been outsourced. And we've seen the same now on fiscal policy with Jeremy Hunt, the former chancellor, saying things like, well, I can't, give duty-free access for tourists to London because the ABR telling me no.
Well, and this is really important because the ABR's scoring, that is to say, the ABR's judgment of what a particular policy does, influences policies that you would have thought had nothing to do with the fiscal side. So mass migration is a policy that the ABR strongly supports, and there were discussions in government about this because people were saying, if we have an extra 100,000 people, that is X% on GDP, that reduces the deficit. And so the ABR was a major and malign influence behind the mass migration that we've had in the last 3 years.
That is completely accurate. And they share a worldview with the Treasury. So the Treasury has always had a view. It wanted to be close to Europe. It believes in high regulation. It prefers big business to small business. This is why it's been so tough on IR35. It just doesn't really like small businesses or sole traders. It supports projects generally near London where they think there are bigger returns. So the worldview of the Treasury is baked into everything the Treasury does, the OBR does, and the Bank of England does. So what you find is a Keynesian way of thinking has been adopted through government, and now it's very, very difficult for politicians to challenge that. And what Rachel Reeves is essentially saying is she wants it even harder for government ministers to challenge. And you asked me earlier, Jacob, why it was that ministers have outsourced these responsibilities. I think they wanted to avoid tough decisions.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and we see that in the National Health Service, where there's been a desire to hand things over to NHS England, so that you have some third party who decides whether to build a hospital rather than, or close a hospital rather than the Secretary of State. But it makes no difference because you
the
saw...
The public still blame you.
That's what I was going to say to you. Politicians don't gain from doing this. The bureaucrats, however, are secure.
Yes, and they've become more and more powerful. And also politicians have used the whole independence of bureaucrats to attack other politicians. So further delegitimising politicians and saying we can only trust the independent experts. We saw that a lot during COVID. We can only trust the scientists. We can only trust, the people with medical expertise. We can only trust the economists. And we know that economists' forecasts are almost always wrong. But it's partly a dereliction of duty by politicians, but it's also playing into the anti-politics mood. But the irony is, of course, the more power that politicians hand out, the even more they're despised.
But we were in office for 14 years. Not just your period of office, but people we like and admire, like Boris Johnson, were in charge. We had a majority of 80 at the end. In the coalition era, we had a majority of 70. Why didn't we do anything about it? What is our failure? Because before you can work out what to do next, don't we need to look at ourselves and see what we got wrong?
Well, I think our problems go right back to the 1990s. They go back to the then Conservative opposition, essentially accepting Blairism, accepting the Human Rights Act, which has now made it very, very hard to deport illegal immigrants, accepting the Equality Act, which essentially embedded wokery into our schools and institutions, accepting the Climate Change Act, which gave the power to decide carbon targets to another independent body, accepting the Bank of England Act wholesale, which made it impossible to move a governor on, or in fact for the government to really have a say over monetary policy. But, we weren't around at that time. We maybe could have done more in 2010 to challenge the senior ministers at the time and say these are the things we really needed to change. But I think certainly personally, by the time I got to sufficient seniority to just see how bad it had got, how difficult it was to do things as a minister, it was too late. We'd run out of time.
And so if we look to the future, how is this going to be changed? Because it looks to me as if it's going to become more extreme. I'm also interested that if you look at the King's speech, the King's speech could, 75% of it, possibly more, have been the King's speech of the previous Conservative government.
That tells you what you need to know, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. And the budget earlier in the year could have been delivered by Rachel Reeves other than the 2p off national insurance. That you've got a political and bureaucratic system, of which we have been part, that seems to decide...
We have been ejected from it, Jacob.
Well, we may have been by the voters.
We're now by the voters.
By the voters who held us accountable for this failure, but they have voted us out, but nothing has changed. How do we get change in future?
So people did vote for change. They voted for change in 2016. They voted for change in 2019. They were desperate for change by 2024, and we hadn't delivered change. And I've talked about what I think were the bureaucratic obstacles. There were other obstacles as well, such as Conservative MPs not being conservative enough and not being prepared to stand on their principles and giving in to lobby groups, whether those were environmental lobby groups or woke lobby groups, because they wanted to be popular at, London dinner parties. There were all those factors as well. What do we need to do now? Well, we need to be the party of change. And we need to actually not just attack Labour for what they do over the next 5 years, and God knows it's terrible. You know, Ed Miliband is going to push the prices of energy up to astronomical levels. We're going to see appalling levels of taxation. Our public services are not going to be fixed. They're going to be made worse. We know that no roads are going to be built now, so the traffic jams we're all experiencing are going to get worse. But we can't just attack Labour. We actually have to say, this is the problem with the unaccountable bureaucracy. Here is what Andrew Bailey is doing wrong. Here's the lack of accountability of the Office of Budget Responsibility. This is the problem with the Climate Change Committee. We have to point out the structural failures in Britain so that we have, in the future, a mandate to actually change it. And I think that is our challenge. That is our absolute challenge.
And this is what we've learned from our period in office. It's essentially learning from our mistakes and putting them into place. But we have to admit that we made mistakes in 2010 to 2024.
We absolutely did. And I think we can look across the Atlantic for an example of the way that Donald Trump talks about draining the swamp. It is the same issue that they have in the United States about the difficulty of getting Conservative policies through. And I think one thing I did want to say is what we know is the bureaucracy is fundamentally hostile to Conservative policies. Now, there was an incident in the King's speech where the memo personally criticised me and my government that was written by impartial civil servants. Now, that shows to me that there is a groupthink, there is a leftist groupthink within the bureaucracy itself. And I think we need to be very clear about that. There are too many Conservatives who think they can simply turn up, on the first day of a job as a minister, hand over the list of proposals and it will get done. I'm afraid that is not true. We now have a bureaucracy that is hostile on the whole. There are some good civil servants, don't get me wrong, but is hostile to Conservative policies. And we've seen the Director of Propriety and Ethics, Sue Gray, is now the Labour Chief of Staff.
Indeed. Well, the London sewer was put in after the big stink, so I think draining the swamp is an appropriate analogy. Thank you very much, Liz. Coming up, we'll be hearing some more reaction from what the former Prime Minister has told us, as well as the Labour Party's decision to take money from Tory voters and give it, oh, what a surprise, to Labour voters.
Good evening. Here's your latest GB News weather forecast from the Met Office. The high temperatures, the high humidity will continue across the southern parts through the next few days, and that brings the risk of some thunderstorms. High pressure is generally in control, leading to a lot of fine and settled weather, but there is a weak front across northern parts of Scotland, and here it is a bit fresher than elsewhere. But as we go through the night, do watch out for some hefty showers pushing into southern parts of England. Some of these could have the odd bit of thunder mixed in as well, and there may be a few pockets of mist and fog, but across southern parts it's really going to be a warm and sticky night. Temperatures really holding up. A much fresher story further north. In fact, in some of the rural spots, the sheltered glens of Scotland, we could fall as low as 4 or 5 Celsius. So a bit of a fresher, chilly start across Scotland first thing, and that front I mentioned earlier bringing some outbreaks of rain to the Northern Isles. Otherwise, it's a dry, bright and sunny story for many. A bit more cloud perhaps across parts of Northern Ireland and some parts of northern England. A bit of a grey start here, but elsewhere across much of England and Wales, any mist and fog patches that do develop overnight will quickly be burnt away by the sun, and there will be plenty of sunshine and plenty of blue skies. That being said, we are expecting a few more showers to develop as we go into the afternoon, particularly across southern southeastern parts, and these showers could be fairly intense. Some heavy downpours, some frequent lightning, some thunder and hail all could lead to some issues. The temperatures are still going to be on the high side, just about getting into the low 30s across the south. Fresher than this, though, further north, similar to today. High teens, low 20s, so feeling warm enough in any sunshine. Into Thursday, and the heavy thunderstorms are going to be a bit more widespread. Across much of England and Wales, there is the risk of some thundery downpours. Meanwhile, across Scotland and Northern Ireland, a few showers are possible, and it is going to be a little bit cloudy at times. Friday's looking like it will be a bit drier for many before something fresher and wetter by the weekend. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates. You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it?
Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday,
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking,
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
down to earth,
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
and most importantly, honest,
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get the book thrown at them.
then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Stephen Dixon, and thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I was talking to Liz Truss, and your mail mogs have come in. John says, essentially, that we created the ABR, and that's one of many examples of the Conservatives laying the groundwork for the Starmer administration to further the constitutional vandalism started by Blair and co. So basically saying it's our fault. And Austin says, I have listened a couple of times to Liz, and I must say she's always sounded believable. How did we get lost with Rishi and Starmer? Well, joining me now for some more reaction to State of the Nation's interview with Liz Truss is my panel, former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the PR consultant, and former Labour aide, Stella Santikaidu. Stella, you listened to Liz. Do you think she's right that politicians need to take control and that we get blamed anyway, say these independent bodies are fairly useless?
I think that she's still incapable of taking responsibility for what happened. She was saying about it is so impossible to run the country with all of these rules and all of that. I do not see where it is her understanding as a senior politician who ran to be Prime Minister of this country, her understanding of how to govern, of how to actually run this country. Is she suggesting that there is no way for a politician basically to govern because of the OBR, because of an institution that was created by the Conservative Party? I was really shocked when she blamed the OBR for immigration tripling under the Conservative Party's government. It is shocking that she would say that.
Well, the ABR kept on saying that if you have more immigration, the economy will grow and you'll reduce the deficit. So there was a very strong bureaucratic push from the ABR.
Bureaucratic push, but still, you are still suggesting that she didn't have a choice, that it was not her powers. And also, I think that I really didn't like about the way she was speaking about all of these things is that she was already aware of these things. She was already aware of the chokehold of the OBR. So she should have prepared. She should have prepared for the fact that the markets would react in the way they were doing that, because she caused a lot of harm in a very short period of time. And I think that a sensible government comes in saying, we already know how it works. This is not a surprise to us. And they take responsibility for it.
And the Bank of England only took responsibility for its mistakes 6 weeks ago. And therefore, the narrative arose that it was all Liz's fault, which turns out to be very unfair, that the Independent Bank of England had basically been asleep at the wheel.
Yes, OK, you say that, but a few weeks ago we had the massive IT shutdown, and that was because of big companies like Microsoft. Do you go and say, oh, it's really unfair because Microsoft is not being elected in? The government is a very complex system. Of course they did, but government is a very complex system. There is not one person that holds all of the power ever. You have different institutions that you have to respect and you have to work with, not against.
Yeah, Kelvin, do you have more sympathy for Liz, that actually these bureaucratic stumbling blocks are pretty serious, and her period of office showed that you can't just push them to one side?
I don't really. I understand what the argument is, but, you know, we work in a populist democracy, and her arguments are so technical that I find it for her future in politics. I realise there isn't a great one right now. Right? If she wants to have influence, she's going to have to.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off because there's some breaking news. I've got to go. Well, everyone always likes to hear from Polly. Polly, we're going over to you.
Jacob, thanks very much indeed. Sorry to interrupt your programme, but just to give our GB News viewers and listeners a sense of what's happening in Southport tonight. Of course, a community in mourning after 3 little girls were killed in a knife attack. And earlier on, of course, hundreds attending a vigil in the city after those 3 little girls were named by Merseyside Police. We're bringing you live pictures that are being streamed to us from the centre of Southport. And if you're watching on television, you'll be able to see a heavy police presence in the ordinary suburban streets of Southport tonight, where we can also show you pictures from earlier on where police vehicles were set alight after that morning this evening turned to anger, outrage and a sense of anger, it must be said, well, it appears to be directed at the police. Many people there, of course, filming, but we can see in the centre of that shot there, police with riot shields, and we know that the police were also threatened as well. We know police helicopters were circling overhead earlier on, and we've seen footage this evening showing the police not only holding up those riot shields, but holding them up for a reason as well. Bricks being thrown at police, and now police vehicles set alight. So as a community in mourning tonight tries to come to terms with the grief that they're experiencing collectively and understand what is happening in their midst, we must remember, of course, those 3 little girls named by Merseyside Police who have died in that unprovoked attack at a holiday dance day that was organised for young Swifties, Taylor Swift fans, at the start of the UK summer holidays. Elsie Dot Stancombe, Alice Da Silva Aguirre and Baby King, just 7, 9 and 6 years old, killed. And we must remember also 5 other little children in hospital and 2 adults critically injured as they bravely, Merseyside Police said, tried to stop the attacker in his tracks. We do know a 17-year-old boy from Banks in Lancashire, that's just north of Southport, has been arrested on suspicion of murder and attempted murder. He remains in custody. And Merseyside Police tonight underlining that the families of the girls who are being supported by specialist family officers have asked for privacy and the deaths of those girls to be respected at this time. But clearly tonight in Southport, a sense of anger on the streets. More in our bulletin at 9.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Well, thank you to my panel. Coming up, I'll be speaking to one of my former colleagues amidst rumours of Tory defections to reform.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Apparently, almost 70% of 18 to 25-year-olds, we don't know whether that's men or women, but they say that women shouldn't breastfeed in public. 19% would even go as far as labelling it disgusting.
Well, only a quarter of Brits say that women shouldn't have to cover up when they're breastfeeding. So clearly there is a big debate here and one to get to the bottom of. And to do so, we're joined by parenting journalist Annette Kellu. Really good to see you this morning, Annette.
Really good to see you.
Why is this stigma still existing in our society?
I think we've got a case here going on of double standards. I don't know about you, but I live near a park, OK? One little hint of sun, the men get completely naked. Honestly, you've never seen anything like it. The bodies are out, all different shapes and sizes. So why is it not OK for a woman to feed her baby? You know, we've got this whole thing. They're OK to be naked doing what they want. Why can't a woman just feed her baby? Why is it shameful in 2024? And it's interesting what you say about the 18 to 25-year-olds, because I really want to know, are they men or women? Because I feel like they'd be men.
I was going to say, have you got a hunch? Have you got a suspicion?
Yes, I have. And I think as well, they're thinking of them as sexy time, you know? And I feel like they're not... Well, maybe that's because they're bombarded with images and they see things like that they're seeing it in that context. But it's really not. It's feeding the baby. It's simple. Shouldn't be shameful.
But do you think for men it's like they can't see the difference? There's so much porn in society, isn't there, that breasts are sexualised and seen as this sexual object and not actually for their main primary purpose, which is actually feeding a child.
Immediate association.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they can't.
And you can't see that they could have two functions.
Absolutely. And to them as well, I feel like they see it, and on the other side of it, they think like, ooh, mummy, and that brings up weird feelings for them, maybe.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threats on.
As time passes,
She could have saved Storm.
You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment.
This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory.
Don't miss My Big Opinion, Mark Meets and My Take at 10.
Democracy is a funny old thing.
And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it.
Go and get another glass of that bubbly, you've earned it.
That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back. We were talking about Liz Truss and discussing the interview I'd had with her. And John says, John, thank you. You can send mail mogs in again. Excellent interview with Liz Truss, Jacob. It's no surprise that the establishment was largely responsible for the, quote, crash for which Liz was so unjustly accused. And Graham says, shocking how Stella ignores the truth and reality of the influence of the ABR and the mistakes of the Bank of England. That's the real point, not Liz Truss. And it's just another distraction from Stella to say that the Tories brought in the ABR. Well, a couple of weeks ago, rumours began to emerge that 5 Tory MPs were on the cusp of defecting to Reform UK. Indeed, GB News ran a story which claimed the Conservative MP for Brigg and Immingham, Martin Vickers, was one of the MPs considering defection. Now, I must confess that Martin and I are friends who sat together during many hours of parliamentary debate. He is the calmest and kindest of men. So when he said to me that he was steaming about this report, I knew that we had made a blunder. Hence, I'm joined now by Martin. Martin, thank you and sorry. You would like to make it clear that you're not joining Reform or any other...
Absolutely no way would I join Reform. I've been a member of the Tory party for 50 years, and I know I look very...
A young man like you, yes.
But no, the Reform Party aimed to obliterate the Conservative Party, were the one that I fought for 50 years, and there's absolutely no way I would ever consider joining Reform.
And you are Vice-Chairman of the 1922 committee, so you're one of the people responsible for the leadership election. How do you think the Tory party responds to the challenge from Reform and makes itself electable again?
Well, I think the first thing they need to do, and this was the overwhelming view that came through at the 1922 committee a couple of weeks ago, that we don't want to rush into this leadership election. We've got the summer recess, we've got the conference season, and the focus is going to be on the new government, inevitably. So we've got time to actually assess which direction we want to go. And hopefully we will elect a leader who the parliamentary party in particular, but the party in the country will unite around and allow a bit of space to develop new policies to adapt to changing circumstances.
One of the problems we've had as a party, going all the way back to the election of Ian Duncan Smith, but with Ian and then with Boris, was the parliamentary party not accepting the result of the members. How do you persuade the parliamentary party to accept a democratic vote?
Well, the problem starts with the parliamentary party because, of course, we narrow it down to the 2 that go to the membership. And I would hope my colleagues reflect on the fact that it's very good in one sense to give the party membership very contrasting leadership candidates. But in actual fact, what we want is to put forward two people, either of whom we could unite around as a parliamentary party. And I hope that will be at the forefront of my colleagues' minds.
And in terms of the vision for the party, how do you think we recreate a Conservative vision? Because, frankly, the last couple of years weren't very Conservative.
No, I mean, it's repeating what's been said many times. Of course, we had that spectacular victory in December 2019, but within 3 months the pandemic struck, knocked governments here and across the world off course, and we never fully recovered from that. And I think we had to be mindful as we moved out of lockdowns and so on, that the public had become very reliant on the state during that period for furlough payments, grants to businesses and so on. And I think we had to move gently away from that position rather than pull the carpet away from them. And that inevitably made us appear more statist. And that was an unfortunate result of the pandemic.
And what is the secret of your success? When we both got elected in 2010, you had a very, very slim majority.
4,000, yeah.
In 2015, you were very nervous about your seat. You're now one of the 121 survivors. How have you managed to do this?
Focus on the constituency. You've sat in front of me on the green benches many times, and you've heard me ask questions of ministers. Although it might have been a much more general, even an international issue, I always managed to work in the impact on what was then my Cleethorpes constituency. And I've had a relentless focus on that. I've lived and worked in that part of the country for all of my life.
And you were councillor, Conservative Party agent.
Yeah.
So Cleethorpes was in your blood.
Absolutely.
I think I called you the King of Cleethorpes when I was Leader of the House.
Very possibly, yes.
And so it's the Tip O'Neill comment, all politics is local, and you've built up your local base.
Yeah.
Is there a lesson in that for other Conservative MPs?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, there's nothing dishonourable about entering Parliament and wanting to be a minister and so on. And that's a route. We need, obviously, talented people in government. But I entered Parliament sort of in my late 50s. I didn't want to be climbing the greasy pole and being a PPS to a minister who was 30 years younger than me. I wanted to focus and deliver improvements to the people I represent, and that's been my focus from day one. And I'd like to think that that has paid dividends, and certainly during the campaign that we've just gone through, I was recognised as the local candidate, and I kept saying to people when they said, oh, we're fed up with the Conservatives, I said, it's my name on the ballot paper.
Well, that's a very good point, and we certainly had a lot of fun sitting close to each other in the Palace of Westminster. So thank you very much to Martin. Up next is Mark Dolan for Patrick Christie's. Mark, what is on the bill of fare for you this evening?
Well, Jacob, following yesterday's horrific slaughter of 3 little girls at a dance class, Britain is turning into a violent hellhole. Without proper enforcement of the law and of British values, this country is finished. That's my 9 o'clock monologue. Plus, are Labour throwing old people under the bus by axing winter payments? Plus, strap yourselves in for 5 years of strikes and economic chaos. Hate to say I told you so. Mark Dolan in for Patrick from 9.
Well, I don't know there'll be any strikes because they'll just pay off all their left-wing friends in the trade unions with our money. It'll be a very interesting programme, as always. That's coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. I'm in London. My children are in Somerset, and they report to me the weather's absolutely beautiful. They've got the paddling pool out there having a whale of time, and Daisy's enjoying it too.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening. Here's your latest GB News weather forecast from the Met Office. The high temperatures, the high humidity will continue across the southern parts through the next few days, and that brings the risk of some thunderstorms. High pressure is generally in control, leading to a lot of fine and settled weather, but there is a weak front across northern parts of Scotland, and here it is a bit fresher than elsewhere. But as we go through the night, do watch out for some hefty showers pushing into southern parts of England. Some of these could have the odd bit of thunder mixed in as well, and there may be be a few pockets of mist and fog, but across southern parts it's really going to be a warm and sticky night. Temperatures really holding up. A much fresher story further north. In fact, in some of the rural spots, the sheltered glens of Scotland, we could fall as low as 4 or 5 Celsius. So a bit of a fresher, chilly start across Scotland first thing, and that front I mentioned earlier bringing some outbreaks of rain to the Northern Isles. Otherwise, it's a dry, bright and sunny story for many. A bit more cloud perhaps across parts of Northern Ireland and some parts of northern England. A bit of a grey start here, but elsewhere across much of England and Wales, any mist and fog patches that do develop overnight will quickly be burnt away by the sun, and there will be plenty of sunshine and plenty of blue skies. That being said, we are expecting a few more showers to develop as we go into the afternoon, particularly across southern, southeastern parts, and these showers could be fairly intense. Some heavy downpours, some frequent lightning, some thunder and hail, all could lead to some issues. The temperatures are still going to be on the high side, just about getting into the low 30s across the south. Fresher than this, though, further north, similar to today. High teens, low 20s, so feeling warm enough in any sunshine. Into Thursday, and the heavy thunderstorms are going to be a bit more widespread. Across much of England and Wales, there is the risk of some thundery downpours. Meanwhile, across Scotland and Northern Ireland, a few showers are possible, and it is going to be a little bit cloudy at times. Friday's looking like it will be a bit drier for many before something fresher and wetter by the weekend. Bye-bye.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Celebrate a spectacular summer with your chance to win an incredible £30,000 in tax-free cash in our Great British Giveaway. It's the biggest prize of the year so far, and it's totally tax-free. What would you spend that on? Luxury holidays, a new car, or just put it away for a rainy day? Whatever you do with £30,000 in tax-free cash, make sure you don't miss out on a chance to make it yours. For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2, or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Tune in to Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. GB News royalty with your perfect start to the weekend. Lucky us! Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions that raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return. And a few surprises along the way. Might be cold in this studio. That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. 8 to 9 only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates. You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it? Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Good evening, it's 9 o'clock. This is Patrick Christie's Tonight with me, Mark Dolan. I'm with you for the next 3 nights. Tensions boil over in Southport after the brutal killing of 3 young girls as people demand action, not words, from the Prime Minister.
Time for change, Stormer. Come on, needed. How many more children? Is it mine next?
Anger at the Prime Minister as the 3 children killed in the Southport knife attack are named. The youngest was just 6 years old. Next, I'll explain why, without proper enforcement of the law and of British values, we are finished as a country. Also tonight,
I believe that anyone who comes here illegally must be deported within days.
Is a hardline approach to immigration the key to winning the Tory leadership race? I sit down with former Conservative MP Miriam Cates. And just 2 months ago, Sir Keir Starmer was furious with the Tories over winter fuel payments. And now he's axing them. We'll tackle those double standards in just a moment. And I'll deliver tomorrow's front pages with my top panel of pundits. This evening we have social commentator Esther Kraku, former aide to Margaret Thatcher, flown in from the United States to be with us this evening, Niall Gardner, and best-selling author and broadcaster Amy Nicole-Turner. Busy show, a packed 2 hours. Let's get to work. Law and order must be restored to fix broken Britain. Violence has become the norm in this country, whether it's low-level stuff like shoplifting or having your mobile phone snatched from your hand, and more serious crimes like burglary, sexual assault, and indeed more serious stuff like drug crime. All of it's been decriminalised if you look at the rates of conviction. I'll be tackling law and order in just a moment after the news headlines and Polly Middlehurst.
Mark, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, grief has turned to anger tonight in Southport. Riot police have been charged at, and crowds have gathered outside a mosque, where disorder has broken out now following a vigil to remember 3 little girls stabbed to death. A teenager has been accused of murder and attempted murder and is in police custody. Footage from the scene is circulating on social media, and it shows a police van has been set alight, and some members in the crowd have been seen throwing objects, including what appear to be bricks, at police officers. We are monitoring those events in Southport for you tonight, and as we get more detail, we'll bring them to you. Well, earlier on, the Prime Minister paid tribute to the victims of the knife attack. He was faced by hostile shouts from the public as he laid a wreath and stood in silence. Some people shouted, "How many more?" The Prime Minister says it's now his mission to crack down on knife crime.
I am very worried about high levels of knife crime, and I'm absolutely determined that my government will get to grips with it. But today is not the time for politics. Today is the time to focus entirely on the families who are going through such pain and grief, and on the wider community, and of course a time to say thank you to those that responded yesterday.
Let me just bring you a breaking line that we've got from Merseyside Police has just come to me in the last 30 seconds or so. Merseyside Police acknowledging what's happening on the streets of Southport tonight, and they've said, "We can confirm officers are dealing with a disturbance during a protest in Southport this evening. Officers deployed are currently dealing with criminal behaviour and violence, with bottles and wheelie bins being thrown at them." That's just within the last few moments from Merseyside Police. Well, as I said, a community in mourning in Southport, and the Prime Minister's visit coming as police named the 3 little girls who died. They were 7-year-old Elsie Dot Stankham, 9-year-old Alice Aguirre, and 6-year-old BB King. Speaking in the Commons tonight, the Home Secretary described the scenes in Southport as an unspeakable tragedy. Yvette Cooper told MPs it's difficult to comprehend the horror emergency workers faced.
Police, the North West Ambulance Service and Merseyside Fire and Rescue, who arrived at an unimaginably distressing scene yesterday and who responded with heroic professionalism. Aided by passers-by, NHS workers and off-duty emergency workers who heard the calls of distress and ran to help. As the police officers said to me when we spoke, They do these jobs knowing they can be called upon in the toughest of times, but nothing still can prepare you for an attack on little children.
Yvette Cooper speaking earlier. Well, let's not forget that 5 other children and 2 adults remain in a critical condition in hospital tonight after what was described by Merseyside police as a ferocious attack. We now know the attack took place at a Taylor Swift-themed dance workshop at the start of the children's summer holidays. The pop star herself today paying tribute to the victims, saying she's in shock at the loss of life and horrendous trauma, adding they were just little kids. Well, we'll bring you more news from Southport throughout the rest of the evening here on GB News. Now, in other news tonight, a serial shoplifter who committed what was described as near Olympian-scale fraud has been jailed for 10 years today. Narinder Kaur travelled all over the country to carry out what the judge described as a tsunami of dishonesty against top high street retailers, stealing around £500,000 worth of items. Gloucester Crown Court heard the 54-year-old stole from the likes of Boots, Debenhams, John Lewis and TK Maxx more than 1,000 times. And Microsoft has been hit by another global outage, impacting, we're told, email and 365 functions, including Minecraft. The tech giant says it's investigating a network infrastructure issue affecting access to its services. It comes just 2 weeks after a separate major IT outage disrupted global systems, including transportation and healthcare, due to a flawed software update from CrowdStrike. Those are the latest GB News headlines from the newsroom tonight. I'm Polly Middlehurst. I'm back in an hour. See you then.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good evening. Yesterday, 3 children were brutally killed in Southport, the third of whom, a 9-year-old girl, passed away this morning. The 2 other girls were aged 6 and 7. They went there to dance along to pop star Taylor Swift. Now they're gone. 8 other children suffered stab wounds, 5 of whom are